beautiful weather in Sweden. Everybody's outside. They say, well, Swedish summer is the best. And then people will say, yes, I really like that day of the year.
It's not that different from Minnesota. As I look out the window, there is still snow on the ground, and,
Yes.
and it's the middle of April here. So we got dumped on over the weekend. So
Yeah.
enjoy your day of summer, and we'll take ours sometime in mid-July.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So we're going to start with a quick speed round. Your quick, unthoughtful reactions to Michelangelo or Monet?
Michelangelo.
Thaler or Conahan, which deserve the behavioral economics prize, the Nobel Prize, more?
Thaler for bringing it into public policy.
Okay.
Very good. All right. Last one.
Okay. Dishwasher or hand wash your dishes?
Oh, I was just saying I'm moving soon, and I said I really, really need a dishwasher. So that's going to be the one thing I will not compromise on, because I've been hand washing for a long time.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, terrific. Well, we are here to talk about nudges. And you've done some very specific research on nudges. And so maybe could you start by telling us a little bit about where nudges come from?
Yes. So I think that's always an interesting thing to consider when we talk about nudging in the practical sense, because the way nudges are defined, actually saying, well, there are ways that influence our behavior or intervention that influence our behavior without restricting choice or changing economic incentives, really shows that they are defined compared to something else. So they are defined compared to other type of policy instruments, and that would be rules and regulations, economic incentives, or relevant information. So now the question would be, well, why these three? So why is everything else that's not one of these three defined as a nudge? And for that, if we think about how this came into being in economics, maybe we should think about how in the 80s and 90s, Richard Thaler started recording anomalies, so deviations from traditional economic behavior that still were predictable, but that weren't in line with the traditional economic model, the neoclassical model saying, well, people maximize their utility based on their choices, based on the prices, and based on the available information.
So, do economists look at utility differently today? Is utility thought of differently or explained differently in a broader sense today than it was, say, 30 years ago?
I think you can say it that way, yes, if we look at behavioral economics, because now we're starting to integrate other things into this utility function than what it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So now things like moral utility or reciprocity, altruism, these things are being added to the utility function, which we didn't have previously. So previously it was much more of a fixed function. Maybe also was easier to calculate. I think once we start adding all these psychological factors to it, it makes it so much harder to create mathematical predictions. So I think we're still basing this on this utility maximizing model. So the idea is still, how does an individual maximize utility? But then we're adding in other type of factors that weren't in the model at an earlier point in time.
Yeah. So what differentiates, what makes a nudge different from an economic incentive? For instance, like a sales rep who is going to be rewarded with some kind of extra, either monetary or non-monetary reward by achieving something. How is that different from a nudge?
So nudge should be something that doesn't matter. So Richard Thaler also says like a supposedly irrelevant factor. So an economic incentive matters in the economic terms by definition. It's getting a reward. Now you might say, well, being member of the month or sales representative of the month can also matter, and that is true. Once it starts mattering a lot, then I also wouldn't classify it as a nudge anymore. So nudges are really those small things that for this rational person shouldn't matter. So once we start adding these things, I guess getting stars or getting other type of recognition, that could be similar to an economic incentive actually. So a nudge would be more something like the way that something is ordered in an online mask or something, where I could say, well, I can see all the options. It's really a tiny difference, but it does have an effect that I chose or choose the top option most of the time,
Okay.
for example.
So it seems there's a slippery slope in that definition then, because, all right, so getting a star, right? Your manager, hey, great job, email with a star on it, doesn't seem to be relevant in most instances, right? It doesn't have the same impact, at least not an economic impact, and probably from a utility perspective, who knows? But where does that, what is it? Is it 2 stars? Is it, is it the recognition in front of your team? Where does that, where's the cutoff? Or is that still a gray area that it depends?
I think that's a really good question. And we've been debating that also actually yesterday was 2 of my colleagues here writing a new paper on nudges. And we had that same discussion. We said, well, when does a nudge turn into a shove? So is telling people that they shouldn't litter, or that 9 out of 10 other people don't litter, that maybe still falls under a nudge because it doesn't really matter that much. But if I put a picture of you in your hallway and say, well, this person has the worst littering habit, or sorts the least garbage in this building, well, then maybe we're moving out of the realm of a nudge into something that actually has, as we say, economic consequences, because now your neighbors might hate you, or they might come to your door. So in that sense, especially when it comes to these moral nudges,
Yep.
so these are nudges that create some type of additional utility. This can be a good utility, like I feel good about myself, so it can be recognition, but it can also be negative things like shame. So we actually classify that as a moral nudge category and say that that's different from cognitive nudges. And these cognitive nudges are really just mistakes in a way in my decision making. Exactly how choices are presented, maybe also things like default effects, that I'm a little bit too lazy to switch. But that's actually a different category from making people feel good or bad about themselves, because it's a different way of how this would go into the utility function.
So in that utility function, that has almost always been classically an economic term. And it sounds like there's this component, there's the psychology component of this that's being now woven in with the moral nudge aspect about, from an economic perspective, it may not make any difference, but from a psychological perspective, how is this making me feel? Is this making me feel, bringing me down or bringing me up? Is that a clarific? Does that make sense, or am I way off base in that component?
No, exactly. It's so I like this one example by Gary Becker. He's one of these. He also got the Nobel Prize a while back, and he's often this neoclassical traditional economic modeler, but applied to a lot of these social science topics. So he would say, well, you're late for a meeting, you drive up, you don't find a parking space, and then you decide, okay, how much is a fine if I park here in this no parking zone? What's the chance of me getting caught? And then what's the utility of getting to the meeting on time? So how much will I lose for not being there? And then he calculates, well, the probability of getting caught times the fine, and compares that to the benefit of going to the meeting on time. And then he makes a rational decision, which one is better,
right,
and then decides on that. So now if you would say, well, when we add these moral components, it might be like, well, maybe he's going to feel bad for parking in a no parking zone, or somebody looks at him funny and that's why he decides not to do it. So then we can add these moral costs. But maybe we could also change how easy it is to park in the no parking zone. Maybe it would take him 10 minutes to maneuver the car into it or something. So that might make it a little bit more inconvenient, and so then we might have different levels of how this utility changes.
So both could be at play. We could have both this this moral nudge and a cognitive nudge involved in any given experience, right, at the same time.
Of course, because I think often our brain only sees few things at a time, right? So there's so many things that influence us on how we make decisions, how close the paper cups are close to us compared to ceramic cups for our coffee, right? These are not things we think about. And there, for example, we don't create moral costs because one is closer to us, or it's easier to reach. So maybe we take the ceramic cup, or the paper cup is easier to reach. But that's a very different way of restructuring choices. than if we add these moral components.
Yeah, it certainly is. I'm wondering about you brought up Richard Thaler a couple times. You've done some work with Richard, or you know him. You've had some exchange with him. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So we haven't worked together. We have had lunch together at a very nice Korean restaurant in Chicago. So that was really great. So he really took the time. Another colleague of mine and him and me, like we went for lunch and talked a little bit about nudging. The work he was doing was Uber at the time. I had just done this nudge-a-thon in Sweden, organized that. So that was a lot of fun. So it's really great if that these people really take the time to sit down for lunch. And
Did you call that a nudge-a-thon? Is that what you said in Sweden?
Exactly. Yes. So that was
you have to tell us about what is a nudge-a-thon.
I'm sorry.
And what does
Thaler has to wait. We really need to know about the nudge-a-thon.
Yes. So the nudge-a-thon is actually something that was invented by Warwick Business School. So they started doing these case study competitions where they had an outside partner come in, and then the question was, okay, how can we use behavioral science to help them? So a little bit like these hackathons you have in IT, but the idea is a one-day case study competition. And then when I came to Gothenburg University in the beginning, I thought it was a bit sad that there wasn't really a lot of behavioral economics, behavioral science on the lower levels of our bachelor students. So then, I thought it would be fun. I got a little bit of money here at the university and I organized this one-day case study competition and found an outside partner. It was about how to get people to shop more locally in the different areas here in Gothenburg. And then I had invited a couple of other people to give lectures. And really we had people from medicine, from electrical engineering, of course also from business and economics. It was quite fun.
And so who won the Nudge-a-thon competition? Was there one of the case studies? What did they propose?
Yes.
Remember,
so they actually,
sorry, you on the spot.
So they wanted to implement these benches. So the idea was that few people shop in the suburbs, and a lot of people go either to cities or to bigger shopping malls, but they don't really shop locally. And then the question was, why is this happening? And one of the ideas is saying, well, maybe it doesn't feel that nice to be there. Maybe it's not such a nice area, and they don't really have the benefits. And why should you shop there compared to a city where you have higher selection? So their idea was to install benches that face each other, so it's really creating more of a community setting, and then have conversation starters in a way on the trees or something, like ideas how to get to know your neighbor type of conversation starters. So unfortunately we never got to implement it. We thought about it for a while, but then these things happen. We couldn't really get the funding for these benches, but I think that was one of the winning ideas. But these nudge-a-thons are done, I think there was one in Singapore now, in Australia, a couple of more in London. So I think it's a really fun concept.
We might need to think about that for Minneapolis. Here we go. We'll invite you over and we'll have one of these.
And one more question about the nudge-a-thon. Did the contestants know what they were going to be working on the day of the nudge-a-thon in advance? Did you tell them prior to arriving, or did they all walk in at the same time in the morning, and then you say, okay, we're going to be focusing on how to get people to shop local?
Even more than that, because none of them had any prior knowledge on behavioral science or all of these things. So actually they first got some lectures on behavioral science, on experimental design, then they were presented with a case, and then they worked on that. So actually it was completely unknown to them. They just were asked, do you want to participate in making the world a better place? Come sign up for a day and we'll do some nudging.
Very cool.
Wow, that is so cool. And you did that at Gothenburg?
Exactly, yes. So almost 4 years ago now, when I started here. Yeah.
Well, we need to get you to Minneapolis. That's what we need to do, is because the weather is so similar.
You can come and visit the snow. There you go.
Yes, I love that.
Okay, back to Thaler.
Yes.
So, I've heard Richard Thaler described by people who studied under him at the University of Chicago as a visiting dignitary, that he's a very busy guy, and a bit aloof. But so tell us about your lunch at the Korean restaurant. It sounds very very fun and very engaging.
No, it was great. But to your point, being aloof or not being so available before, actually, when I was still doing my PhD in the beginning, I went to San Diego for 4 months and then for 2 months to the University of Chicago. So I spent 6 months in the US. And actually, those 4 months in San Diego, Rich Taylor had an office very close to me. And then I switched to Chicago 1st of May. I was like, what is this old guy now also doing in Chicago at the same time that I switched to Chicago? So it turns out that so I didn't really know much about him, even though we spent 4 months in the same building before, but that was in the very beginning of my PhD. And then he was in Chicago, and he has this deal where in the wintertime he's in San Diego, and then summertime he's in Chicago, or at least it was that case when I was there. Yeah. So I did see him around a lot actually for those 6 months, but we never really got in touch. I also hadn't really worked on nudging. I was working a lot with Uri Knisi, who I was visiting. We're working on deception and feedback, a couple of other topics. So then actually this lunch happened at a much later point, and then realized what he was working on, and where I had more of an interest in nudging.
You said you were working with that's interesting. That's really interesting to get a different perspective on that. You said you were working with Uri Knisi. Did I hear you?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah,
he has done really great work in incentives. What kind of stuff were the two of you working on?
So it was four of us together. Silvia Staccato and Franziska Tausch were also on the project. And yeah, I still really like this paper. I think it was a lot of fun. I think it really fits also Uri's style. So what we did is that we were all at the same conference, and there was one guy who kept interrupting the speakers and giving, well, today I guess we would call them mansplaining things. And it was getting worse and worse, and Uri kept hitting his head on the table. I was like, really, why doesn't anybody tell this guy that he should maybe not talk this much and interrupt this much? But he did. So, but at least it was an inspiration for one of our papers, because we then asked, why don't people like to give negative feedback? Why didn't anybody step up in the break? It would be better for him. It would have been better for the rest of us who were being interrupted constantly. But nobody walked up. So actually what we did in this experiment is that, and yeah, this is maybe a bit controversial, but we had 10 guys and 10 girls line up in front of each other. They had to rank each other by attractiveness. And then the guy standing next to the other guy had to tell that guy where he thought he was in the ranking from the girls. So where do you think what do they think they ranked you as? A 10, a 7, a 5? And well, I mean, if it's face to face, we found that everybody was lying, definitely. Saying, well, you're definitely better than average. But when they were just paid to be correct, so when it wasn't being told to the other person, well, they were really good actually at estimating where the other person was in the ranking. Obviously themselves, they were always on top of the ranking, even if we paid them a lot. They still were best looking bunch in the group. Yeah, and when it was anonymous feedback, they were actually, and I think this was a bit more surprising, they were also quite honest. So if it couldn't be traced back to them, they would still say, yeah, I think you're not that good looking, or the girls probably don't think you're that good looking. And actually we paid them up to $50 to give a correct answer. And in face-to-face, they would still lie, and in the other treatments, yeah, they were quite mean, I guess.
So again, in thinking about some of those, the psychology, the psychological costs of giving somebody negative feedback to their face obviously didn't outweigh the monetary benefit of the $50 that they could get from that. Is that one of the insights?
Yeah. So there we really see that, you feel too bad. I think it's really not so much about feeling bad for the other person, but really you don't want to be the messenger. So you don't want to be the one who is the one to bring the bad news. And because that might have consequences on potentially how people treat you later on, but maybe also just how you see yourself. I mean, these were all anonymous, in a sense, students who came to the lab who didn't know each other previously. But of course, it's a university campus, so it's not impossible. You might run into each other again.
Yeah. So reciprocity, or the fear of reciprocity, wasn't so much at play. It was just about actually delivering the message in what you guys discovered.
Yeah, so in the experiment, there's no possibility for reciprocity afterwards. So you're really just sending a message and said person A, and people were wearing a sticker was A, so you could identify them as A, said they think you're 2 or something in
Yeah.
the ranking. But then the experiment ended and everybody left. So there was no direct interaction.
So it wasn't like Kurt rated me and then I rated Kurt.
No, you
Well,
always
you'd
just
rate me
rated one
really,
other person.
you would rate me really high, of course.
I would, of course. And then
I would be realistic.
Then you'd be realistic with me, of course, and I'd be at the bottom of the totem pole. Yes, we know that.
Sorry, we digress.
Yeah. So in a way, like they would both be better off if the other person gave the right answer. So if you were ranking a Kurt and you would have to say which number you are, then and you get it right out of the 10, then both of you would get paid. So both of you would have a benefit from if you get it right. So that was the incentive that we're working on. Saying if I give you the correct feedback and then you say the right thing, because I know that you're probably overconfident, you probably think you're amazing looking. So I should probably say, I think you're not that great looking. So you adjust downwards in your guess of where you are. Yeah, but we don't see that.
Wow.
But it's I mean, that's really interesting to then take that and look at that insight on obviously rating people's attractiveness and the ability to give real feedback, but put that into a work situation or in that conference as you were talking about, where the element of giving honest feedback to somebody can have significantly more impact than $50 if an organization, right? If you have a bad manager who's doing bad things, the cost of that for the organization over the long run, thousands of, not millions of dollars, depending upon their place. And so what did you find any way of overcoming that, or has there been any subsequent research that you've followed up, and what allows people besides that anonymous component? Or
so we haven't done any additional research except the anonymous part. So I think one of the findings is to say, okay, and I was actually now asked to be a bit of an advisor to an app they're developing in the UK, which is a bit about giving feedback to colleagues. And then the question really is, how much can we make it anonymous? So of course you don't want people trolling or people saying, but if it's with your colleagues, I think then you shouldn't really be expecting that. That's really going to be too unfriendly. So I think in most cases, we just see that people are being too polite. I mean, first of all, they have too high opinions about themselves, and then they get this good feedback from others. And then we have this mechanism where people, have too high expectations about themselves.
This is a real challenge. I've been talking to some companies who are trying to make the recognition and feedback model more effective for companies. And one idea that I've heard recently that I thought was really good is that when, let's say I was presenting in a meeting and the two of you were in it, after the meeting, I solicit your feedback. I ask you for your feedback. So, and I do it through a form. And because it was, because I was presenting and I'm interested in your feedback on presenting, the message to Kurt and Christina is, Tim wants your feedback on how he presented at the meeting. And then it gives you some choices about, from, outstanding, concise, clear, et cetera, to maybe something that was like not clear, didn't follow a good narrative, or, there's some specific feedback. And I was impressed by this because my thought is that if that feedback is solicited, that people might be more honest rather than unsolicited feedback. What do you think about that, Christina? Do you think that there might be more possibility in a corporate setting for someone to be more open and more honest if they're being asked for their feedback?
I think so. I think one of the criticisms that people had with our paper was also to say, well, maybe you can't do much about your attractiveness, but you can do things about something else. So I think similar, you would say, like, if somebody already bought a wedding dress, you're not going to say it looks bad because you're not going to return it. So,
it's done, right.
But if you're still in the dressing room and you're putting something on and you could still change something about it, then you might say, maybe you'll try something else.
Right.
So I think that's really the idea also, like how much can people change, and are then people more willing to say something? But then again, I still think that yeah, it also matters on how much does this is this going to affect us also. It doesn't matter if that person really changes behavior, or do we just want to be polite? So I think the further you are away from me in work conditions or something, then I mean, why should I be very direct to something in my feedback if I don't really get something out of it, except that you maybe think I'm not that nice?
Yeah, it's interesting.
So if you work close together.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. It's interesting. The Ray Dalio, the founder and I think he's CEO of Bridgewater Associates, and he's talked about the culture that they do in Bridgewater Associates, which is this radical. I forget, he has a name for it. Radical transparency, I believe, where they literally, like to your point, that's what made me think about it, is they ask for that feedback and people are expected to give feedback. And I heard just a recent podcast where they were taking, one of the gentlemen, one of the managers was in front of 200 people of his managers, was rated as the worst manager in the company in front of everybody else.
Oh my gosh.
But he took it, and they interviewed him, and they were saying, it's actually, he said it was really, opening, because I want to improve. And the only way I improve is by knowing, all right, so this is reality. And so being that transparent, I would find that very hard. I think
I would too.
But
that would be really hard.
But it's interesting with all of the conversation that this is being around in different things. I'm wondering if a culture of having that transparency and that feedback can actually help in people giving that feedback, if that's the expectation. So,
or in other words, could a company foster a corporate culture that enables open and honest feedback between people that isn't trolling, that is not derogatory or mean-spirited? I like the sound of that.
It's interesting. Anyway,
we
digress. We digress. Back to nudges.
And ethics. Let's talk about ethics. That we oftentimes in our podcast get to the topic of ethics, and it's a big deal for us. We are really concerned about the ethical use of any kind of psychological
behavioral science.
Yeah, behavioral science tool. What are your thoughts about that? I know that you've put some time in on the ethics question, Christina. What do you think about this?
Exactly. So I think it is a question that's being asked a lot, and I also find it very important if we want to have behavioral science and nudging as a policy tool. Well, then we really need to figure out where are the lines. And one recent paper that I was working on called "The Hidden Costs of Nudging," we really wanted to see what are these unintended consequences of carrying out to nudge. So often the studies that we see are done in a way that we want to change behavior, and then we do the nudge and we see if the behavior changes in a predictable way. But we don't really see what else changes at the same time. So there might be, if I nudge you to eat more vegetarian food at lunch, maybe you're going to have a steak for dinner, and much more than you would have had otherwise. So it's not clear if this was a good idea to begin with. Or in our case, we send people reminders to give to charity, and every time we send a reminder, also more donations came in, but on the other hand, also more people unsubscribed from the mailing list because they thought it was annoying to get these reminders. So from that, we derived that for some people, there must be this, what I already said before, these moral costs, these guilt costs, hassle costs of getting these reminders. And since the response rates to our campaign was usually about 1%, it means that 99%, half of them probably put it in spam folder immediately, but at least the rest of them, they only got this negative feeling of getting this reminder, being asked to give to charity, but they didn't want to give at that point of time, so they might have felt guilty. So, or if your gym keeps sending you reminders, yes, for some people, it might help them to remind them to go to gym, and maybe exactly this factor of feeling a bit guilty helps. But there's also a lot of people who just feel the guilt. So if we think about this from a national perspective, a policy perspective, the question is, once we start nudging everywhere, especially using things like these moral costs, are we creating a lot of negative feelings in a lot of people? And what type of consequences does that have?
Well, when you come up with that line, will you send us a note?
Exactly.
It is an interesting component when you're talking about the unintended consequences of a nudge, which on face value seems really, it meets all the criteria that you set it out to meet, using framing on some of these different things, the reminders, as you said,
Choice architecture.
the choice architecture, but it is those unintended consequences that, as you pointed out in the paper I read, we don't all, at least researchers haven't always looked at those contrary components. And so when you're looking at the overall impact, it was skewed because you didn't take into those other factors into account. So I think that's a really good point to take, and particularly as organizations are starting to use nudges more and more and more. Yeah, we get more people to sign up for the 401k plan, but what does that have to do with the rest of their savings in other aspects of their life? And does that have the negative component, and how does that impact them? Are other factors that go into that? So
it's complex. I mean, we're complex, and I can feel, I'm sensitive to how lazy my brain is. I'm sensitive to how
just your brain. Sorry.
Unfortunately, Christina, we work together way too much. But I'm aware of the these shortcomings that I have in terms of wanting to take shortcuts in my decision making and in thinking about things, because it just feels so much easier. And so I think you're asking a really, really good question. How do you deal with it in your own life?
That's also a good question. Maybe just about taking the shortcuts. I think we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves. I think we need shortcuts. If we make, we used to say in my nudging course, it's like if you would deliberately think about everything you're doing, you would never leave the house, because you need to have habits, right? You need to have things that you like, that you put on. You don't need to think about, do you want coffee or tea? I mean, often these things are just things we do. So, and I think also nudging can be really helpful in these situations when we have other things to think about, when we're stressed, or even people who have a lot of other constraints. I work a lot with people working with nudging and sustainability, and I say, yeah, but people should be convinced that they should be better in environmental issues. They should want to sort their trash, and they should want to take public transport, and they should want to turn off the light when they leave the room. But I think, yeah, but that's maybe also a bit arrogant almost to think that we have these cognitive capacities to think about this all day, about how we can do climate change. But there might be other people who don't know how to pay for the gas for the car, or I don't know, or have a sick child or something like this. And then I think, can't we use nudging also to help these people, and not say, oh, but they need to want to do this in a rational way. They need to think as much as we do about environmental change. So maybe we can just make it easier through nudging for them to do the right thing.
I love that. I love that. Go ahead.
So have you seen any bad nudges, and bad being relative to your own kind of definition?
Is this like on the moral side?
On the moral side. And actually probably on the practical side too. I'm sure there's lots of examples on, hey, we tried this and it backfired on us. But from a moral perspective, are there nudges that you think might just have gone over the line? And I don't know, maybe it's from the perspective of their intent, or maybe it's from perspective of the unintended consequences that you mentioned before. Have you seen any, or have you identified any of those?
So I think recently there's been a lot of talk about sludges, right? So nudges with bad intentions. And I think and those are really the ones with bad intentions. I think Richard Thaler recently tweeted one of Wells Fargo, who seemed to have stolen some money from their clients and then sent them these dingy envelopes and saying, sign here and send them back if you want your stolen money back, something like that. And then, of course, making use of these laziness, or that people are not attentive to these envelopes, and then assuming that people will not send these envelopes back, so they don't need to pay out the money. So I think that's a very obvious way. And when I present this, then I often say, well, does it fail the New York Times test? So if you feel happy if this is on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, then it's probably more of a nudge in a good way, this nudging for good. And if you would feel really embarrassed, then I guess it falls more into the sludge category. So I think that's really the intended ones. But what we're doing right now, we're doing this project or planning this project in South Africa right now with the Ministry of Health. And there the idea is, how can we nudge pregnant women or young mothers to take more vitamins, to adhere to HIV treatments, to potentially breastfeed more, these type of questions. And there you might use reminders or social norms or these type of nudges. And there I think there's actually a risk that you might potentially be overdoing it. So that even though it's very well intended, so that the idea is really, we have a lot of infant mortality because they aren't breastfeed, because there is contaminated water. So yes, we do want to really push these mothers to behave along these lines. But that could also be a risk that this is a very vulnerable population. So maybe we're actually making it worse because people will feel bad about the actions that they're not taking and then maybe try to hide that. So I think that's really a situation where I think the intentions are only good, but where maybe nudging can like do too much if not done correctly.
Yeah, that's a great example. Again, best intentions in the world, but you have to think through, layers and layers of how that can impact different people. So that be very interested to find out what your end result is on that and how you guys overcome some of those issues.
Well, so we're going to stay in touch, Christina. We're going to have to look. We're so enjoying this, and I'm pretty certain that Kurt and I are going to have a lot more things to talk about with you. So we want to.
Well, I'd love to be back.
We have a Nudge Fest in Minneapolis.
Yes.
So I think we're getting close to time, and I know you always have a ending question here.
You go ahead.
No, it's your area of expertise. I don't want to step on your toes.
Well, Christina, you know that because this is the behavioral grooves, and grooves are in vinyl records and make music. We like to talk about music. So can you tell us a little bit about your musical interests? What is it that would you say that there's any kind of music that defines you?
So I think, to be really honest, I think I'm the person that Spotify thought of when they made these playlists that say dinner music, party music, morning music, calm music. So that's so I think I'm probably one of the biggest users of these type of Spotify playlists. Okay. But I was thinking about like one song, something that that came to mind. It was in Costa Rica surfing 2 weeks ago, and I was in the waves and I was struggling, and it was really hard to get back into the lineup. And I was thinking about, okay, how is this similar? And I was thinking about, actually surfing is a lot like this academic process. It's like a lot of struggling 99% of the time. It's a lonely struggle by yourself. You never know if it's going to be worth it. And I was thinking about this one. It's a German song. It's called Die perfekte Welle, which means the perfect wave. And the song is actually, it's called it's a band called Juli. I don't know, I guess it's from the late 90s or something.
Okay.
Juli, which means July in German. And the song is really about this feeling that, you've years of struggling and then finally you have that perfect wave. And it's true. I mean, also when surfing, most of the 10 days I was in surfing, it was mostly just paddling. But then when you do manage to get that one perfect wave, it's really a great feeling. So
isn't it?
That really describes my life in that sense.
That's terrific.
I have never understood, I have never tried surfing, so I shouldn't say this, but I have always watched it and I go, they're working really, really, really hard for about 15 seconds of stuff. And then they work really, really, really hard. And I go, that just seems too much work for me.
No, because that 15 seconds is amazing. It's amazing to feel that wave just start pushing your board forward and just like, this is magic. Yeah, it's terrific.
Exactly.
I'll hop on skis and give the chairlift take me up to keep my feeling going down.
Christina, thank you so much for taking time today. This has really been a lot of fun for us. And and we want to have a Nudge-a-thon in Minneapolis, so we want you to be here for it. So
let's do it.
Okay. Love that.
Christina, nice meeting you, and thank you. And any last words for listeners?
Well, I guess we should quote Richard Taylor here on a podcast on nudging and say, nudge for good.
There you go. All right. What a great ending. So thank you.